Good morning. Welcome to ASL's HR in 10.
At 10.
I'm Jason Perry.
And I'm Kimberly Bradshaw.
And we're just feeling slightly stressed this morning because all our best laid plans to get this working on time failed when Kimberly's computer decided to do an automatic update a few minutes before we went live. So, all organised and prepared as you'd expect.
And now I'm so overheated, my glasses are steaming hot.
Well, it strikes me it's all about preparation, isn't it, Kimberly? And that brings me to what's caught my attention, which, there's been a rather prominent case of somebody appointing somebody as a chairman without, let's say, doing adequate background checks.
Yes, that's basic stuff, really, isn't it?
Well, it's interesting because employment background checks have changed so much over the years. We've seen people take less interest in references, haven't we? And they're so important.
They are. They can tell you a lot. Even if it's the most basic one, you can still read between the lines. And, we're not allowed to give a bad reference, but you can understand what somebody's saying and you want to be alerted if there's, a potential problem.
Yes, and there's a lot to focus on getting right. I mean, I think I mentioned recently we have one of our clients and they have some element of their work in the defence sector. And they decided to bring in something called BPSS checks, which are the baseline security checks, which kind of organisations like the MOD and the Civil Service do. And bringing those in can be quite complicated as well, can't it?
Well, yes, because you have to make sure that it's equal for everyone. Am I right in thinking that they were only going to do the checks on certain people?
There was guidance apparently that came from the US that was suggesting that they needn't check the background on UK workers, so I'm led to believe. And you're right, you've got to apply any process proportionately so you don't have discrimination.
Yes, and also, doing what the US say is, their laws, their state and federal laws are completely different to ours.
Well, again, you've got this big difference between, let's say, what your client requires contractually, possibly even legally, if your contract is based in another country. But if you employ people in the UK, none of that absolves you from UK employment law, and you have to make sure it's in line with our legislation.
Yeah, I mean, the law of the land where you're employed is what takes precedent.
Yes. So what about, what's been going on in Westminster is kind of interesting. What about things you don't officially know, but you kind of do know, which is what was going on here. If you're hiring somebody and you're part way through the process and something's brought to your attention that you don't officially know, how would you handle that as an employer?
Well, I would have thought if you had some, a set process of basic checks that you wanted to put in place that applied to everybody, then you would perhaps find that out during that process.
Yes. And actually, there's no reason at all why it can't come into part of your selection process or your interview process. If the role is important, doing financial background checks and asking each candidate the same information and putting them through the same process would be entirely appropriate, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, the basic ones are, obviously you want references, you want to check right to work, you want to do financial if it's relevant. There's all sorts of different checks that you can do depending on the sector, and they should just be standard across your employees.
Yeah. And what do you think about social media checks? Because we get asked quite a lot on this, and I think it's a fascinating area because you're perhaps crossing the line I've just painted with what you might find out. Where do you lie on social media checks?
I think it's very difficult because you can make a decision perhaps or have some kind of unconscious bias on the basis of what you see there, which might not be accurate or reflective. So I think basing a decision might be challenging, unless it's in your policies, in your contract, that you will check social media. But otherwise, I think it's a bit of a a sticky wicket, really.
Yeah, I mean, my concern here would be whether you have the right to access that data. And if you're looking at things that are personal, private data and you haven't got a right to use that, but it's all going to come back in my mind to again about what you ask the candidate. So if you find something that concerns you and you talk to the candidate about it, then I think that's broadly speaking okay. But if you find something out, we had a case some years ago that was mildly amusing, where we put a candidate forward and a client rejected them and actually said, have you not looked at the media? And there was a case where this particular individual had a criminal conviction some years before, was actually treated as spent, but they were caught in a police raid with a car boot full of sex toys that were stolen from their former employer. It was very amusing in some ways, but should an employer consider that, because it was in the news, albeit only by having done a Google search, at a later date? Something like that could be quite tricky.
It can. Thankfully, sometimes it's a lot more straightforward. We were working on we were supporting the recruitment of a care manager, so to manage a care home for a client, and we were doing all the HR remits, and we did a DBS check. When she was first appointed, and we had the rolling one. And so when her 6 months probation was coming up, we did another check. And in the time that between she'd been employed and the probation was coming to an end, she'd been what's the word? Arrested. Sorry,
Yep.
mental blank there. Arrested for violent attacks on her daughter.
Oh.
So.
Yes.
And also we had one of our current clients, Jason, they had an employee who was being disparaging about the employer on Facebook.
Yeah.
But because they were friends on Facebook as well, they got to see it. So,
yes. Yes.
Social media is a very tricky one.
But it makes the point that your information needs to be up to date.
Yeah.
And a pre-employment check is only at a point in time to try and reassure you of what you're doing. But it's important to be thorough, because if you find that out 3 months into employment and didn't seek to check it, there's very little you can do. Yes. But if you did seek to find it and were given misinformation, you can act on it very clearly, very decisively. And that is really the significant reason to get your processes right up front, isn't it?
Yes, and also it's about protection of the business, because if the Home Office decide to come knocking on your door to check that you're employing everybody correctly, if you haven't done the pre-employment checks, right to work and things,
indeed,
you could be in trouble. I mean, obviously it's an extreme circumstance, but you can be jailed. There's a fine.
The fines are very big.
£1,000
yes.
per employee, so there's a lot to be careful of.
No, indeed. Kimberly, we could talk forever on this subject, but as we always do, we've waffled on for 10 minutes. So this is HR in 10, and we're out of time, I'm afraid, for this week.
Dear, what a shame.
So we will be back next week. We're going to take a brief break because I have really important things to do on Thursday, as my daughter will be 18, and I don't think she'll forgive me if I run off doing work that morning.
Yes.
So next week we'll take a break, but we'll be back in 2 weeks and keep you up to date with what's going on in HR then.
Look forward to it. See you then.
Thanks.